Welcome back, everybody. We're now looking at Lecture 13. This is the second lecture on the Roman Empire. So this focuses on the height of the empire and the beginning of the fall of the empire. So the main things to be looking out for are items related primarily to Trajan and Hadrian. We're looking at the Forum of Trajan, the portrait bust of Hadrian, the Pantheon, and the equestrian statue of Marcus Aurelius as the pieces to know for the test. So Trajan is emperor from 98 to the year 117. Hadrian, who is the adopted son and heir of Trajan, will rule from 117 to 138, and he is succeeded by Antoninus Pius. He is the adopted son and heir of Hadrian. And then, of course, his adopted sons will become co-emperors. We're looking really at what the era that we refer to as the era of the good emperors, Trajan, Hadrian, and Antoninus, ending with Marcus Aurelius. And then we move into a period of pretty severe disruption in continuity. We have a variety of different factions vying for control, and we have several different approaches to how the empire is going to be ruled. That period of anarchy ends with the period of the Tetrarchs, and the era of the Tetrarchs is rather unusual. Diocletian is emperor, and he solidifies his control over the empire by farming out some of the management duties. He ends up appointing a co-emperor, and then a year after that, subdividing further the duties among 4 leaders. So we have the era of the Tetrarchs, and of course that doesn't go terribly well, and the empire is then reconsolidated under the emperor Constantine. So the Forum of Trajan is our next focus, and we talked before about the idea of the Roman Forum as a public space, a large open public square. Usually a basilica would be included. The basilica would be a civic building. You'd have spaces there to conduct business related to law. You would also have libraries and temples. These were built in honor of and at the behest of various emperors, so they are trying to show their own power and to kind of leave their legacy on the city of Rome itself. So you can see here the Forum of Trajan is rather large. Notable, if you look closely, you can see the Column of Trajan makes it fairly easy to identify the overall layout of the Forum of Trajan itself. The Forum includes his basilica, 2 libraries on either side of the large column that is erected in his honor. So the Forum of Trajan was designed by the architect Apollodorus of Damascus. It is a pretty massive undertaking in terms of the sheer size and also of the importance to civic life. The basilica itself is a rectangular shaped building that has rounded ends on the short ends. We call these apses. And the entrance to the basilica is on the long side of the rectangle. The interior space is sort of similar to the Greek temple in that it is divided by columns, so that there is a space that you can walk around, almost a hallway of columns or colonnade. But rather than having that on the outside of the building, as we saw with Greek temples, now this is on the interior. And the 2 altar-type shapes, the apses on either end, would be focal points within the building itself. You can exit through the back of the Basilica of Trajan. You would have a library on either side, and then the Column of Trajan in the center, and then the temple deifying Trajan as a god is there as well. The column is inscribed with the military victories of Trajan. Trajan is the emperor who expands the empire to its absolute widest point, and then Hadrian is the emperor who defends the borders of that empire. You may be familiar with Hadrian's Wall. So these are arguably 2 of our most powerful emperors. The empire has expanded to its greatest extent, and so the erection of this monument is to mark not only the power of the emperor to record all of his important victories, but also to make sure that we mark his ability to change the land, because the height of the column itself actually marks the height of the original hill at this site that was graded down to create the space for him to build this incredible edifice. So it shows the power of the emperor over the land itself. In addition to these other buildings within the Forum, we also have the markets of Trajan, which are really fairly remote. This is the floor plan of the Basilica Ulpia, the Basilica in the Forum of Trajan. Again, you can see the libraries on either side of the column. You can see the spaces for the judges on the two apses, and you get the sense of where the main entrance is along the long side of that rectangle. But then looking at the interior in this cutaway view, you can start to see how this form will evolve eventually into the true Christian cathedral. You see that the columns create these sort of hallways or ambulatory spaces around the perimeter of the rectangle, leaving us a wide open space in the middle. And of course, we're facing a rounded end focal point where we can put a statue of the emperor, statue of a god, if you will. So as you're looking at this space, you start to see how the Christian architects are going to adapt the architecture of Rome and have it serve their own purposes. So again, the Basilica is itself a public building. It is a center for taking care of legal and civic proceedings. Definitely judges would be present there as well. So this is a place that would be frequented by people with business concerns. It was not a space that was solely religious in nature. You can see by these examples here how we've evolved from this rectangular form with columns around the outside into a rectangular form with columns forming aisles on the inside. It is almost as if the Roman basilica has kind of taken the Greek temple and turned the entrance from the short side to the long side, added those round apses, and enclosed the space with a solid wall. So there is an evolution of this architectural form from Greece to Rome, and it will evolve again to the Christian cathedral form. That cathedral form really does a kind of remarkable thing. It removes one of the round apses and adds one additional feature, this crossing aisle, to make the floor plan from above appear to be in the shape of a cross. So really all of these forms are interconnected. One turns into the next and evolves into the next. So you can imagine as the empire expands, we will see the distribution of these ideas, architectural ideas, throughout the empire itself. So the concept of the Christian cathedral will make its way throughout Europe. Here's the detailed overall view of the Forum of Trajan with a entrance, triumphal arch, equestrian statue of Trajan. The Forum itself is the large open space, and then this is the basilica we were looking at, Basilica of Trajan. Libraries, there's the column, and then of course the temple of Trajan. There's the column, so you can imagine that in its heyday, you would have still been able to read the items on the column visually because of the existence of the libraries on either side. You would be able to get up to these second levels and be able to see. So this gives you kind of a reconstruction here of the major victories of Trajan against the Dacians, and these would also have been commemorated in statue form. Statues of the Dacians were throughout the Forum area. They were repurposed into other emperors' monuments, but it's a tribute, I think, to the effort that it took, to the strength of Rome to be honoring the people that not only won, but also the people they had to struggle so hard to defeat. The top of the column would, of course, have had a statue of the emperor as well. The relief itself is over 600 feet in length, and there are roughly 2,500 individual carved figures on that surface. So the story is told essentially in a spiral up from the base that wraps wraps around the column as it rises to its total height. The markets of Trajan to the side of his forum are also really important for us to recognize. We can see some familiar forms. The Romans are fond of those semicircular spaces. We also see, though, that the markets serve multiple functions as well. This is to draw people to the forum. It's almost as if it has become now a not just a civic center, but also a place to go for entertainment and to purchase necessary goods. So you're looking, in some respects, at kind of an ancient world shopping mall. The interior of which is really pretty remarkable because of the use of cement and the barrel vault, the rounded ceiling hallway of the barrel vault, essentially made possible because of round arch technology. We can see here that that hallway has, at 90-degree angles, semicircular roofed hallways branching off of it, forming groin vaults. So the whole space is really logically organized. It divides up into space for shops on the ground floor and offices above that space. But because of the strength of being able to carry so much weight, the groin vaults are able to be perforated to allow an enormous amount of light into this interior space. So you can imagine this as a lively, bright, and welcoming space that people would want to come to and want to spend time and to spend money in as well. So the forum is our public square. We also want to think about public housing. The Romans are well known, especially in the larger cities, for the introduction of insulae, multi-story apartment buildings. Usually these are made with cast concrete or cement and then faced in brick. Multiple stories, usually no higher than 6 stories in height, so multitudes of people could be packed into a smaller space, and of course could be charged rather expensive rent for that privilege. These are veristic portraits of our most powerful emperors, Trajan and his successor, Hadrian, whose nose you can see was broken in battle and is not quite set back in the proper way. You can see that the inheritors of Rome, in a lot of ways, are our own founding fathers. As odd as it may seem, these togaed and, at least in the case of George Washington, these shirtless leaders are our heroes cast in this kind of Roman style. It makes a lot of sense that the artists of the federal period in this country would look back to the art styles of the culture that we so much modeled our governmental structure on as well. So you can kind of imagine that as we move forward in time, by the time we get to the late 1700s, into the early 1800s, there will be a revival of interest in truly classical art and architecture. We'll see that really coming back again. So what we're learning about in Rome will come back to you in Art History Survey 2 when you get to the end of the 1700s and into the 18s. You definitely want to recognize the portrait bust of Hadrian. Definitely recognizable because of the twist in the nose. In this case, the nose, in addition, is also damaged, so that may help you to recognize him as well. Hadrian was definitely obsessed with architecture, and one of the most remarkable examples that we have remains of from his designs is Hadrian's villa in Tivoli, and this would have included an enormous number of buildings. There's an interesting video included in the discussion board that shows you a computer graphic reconstruction of what the space would have looked like, including a building that is entirely circular, that essentially is the shape of a traditional rectangular and square Roman villa that is now rendered in a series of circles. This building, or this complex, included an enormous number of public spaces. In addition to the palace spaces, there were outdoor spaces for eating and entertainments, and rather elaborate gardens as well. So this gives you an overview of the ruins as they are today. And this is a reconstruction of what the complex should have looked like at its absolute height. You can see there's an amphitheater, there's the public spaces, there are temples, there's the palace itself. It's a pretty remarkable resort leisure space for the emperor. This is definitely unusual architecture as well. He tends to follow his own designs, his own taste, and so Hadrian's villa includes this odd colonnade with half-rounded arches on every other pairing of columns, surrounded, of course, with the artwork that he adored, the sculpture that was so much a part of Hadrian's style. This is a floor mosaic from Hadrian's villa, probably a copy of a wall painting by a Greek artist. So you can see that as dramatic as it is and as violent as it is, there's also pretty elaborate indication of three-dimensional spatial illusion. If you look at the centaur's raised hoof and imagine that coming towards you in space, you can see, again, very sophisticated ability to create the illusion of foreshortening. There's also some interesting floor mosaics throughout the Roman Empire at this point. These include this rather remarkable one, probably made by a Greek artist working in Rome. This is called the Unswept. This is a mosaic which creates the illusion of objects, bones, leaves, all kinds of other things that might have fallen onto the floor of a banquet room, some of which are even throwing shadows. If you look closely, you can see a mouse. It's my favorite part there, eating this little piece of leftover food. He's throwing a shadow as well. If you look closely, you can see everything on the floor is rendered to make it appear as if it is actually fully three-dimensional. Pretty remarkable. One of the most remarkable objects to survive from Hadrian's time, of course, is the Pantheon. Now, the Pantheon is a building that we can see today is round when you look at it from the outside, but in its original construction, not only would the level of the street have been lower, but there would have been construction much closer on left and right hand side. So as you approached it, you really would be unable to see much of anything of the building other than that portico with the triangular pediment across the top of the column. So it would look as a traditional, typical temple structure from Rome or from Greece. So the idea was to walk through that portico, through this enormous door, and walk into a space that is exactly the same distance across as it is from floor to ceiling, meaning that it would house a perfect sphere. It is the largest dome structure in the world at this point, and it remains so for centuries after. The building is entirely constructed in the dome area from cast concrete. So imagine using wooden forms and filling those forms with liquid concrete, allowing them to harden and removing the forms from that space. So it would allow you to create something in a faster, more efficient manner. But it also is an engineering miracle, considering that the amount of weight that would have to be suspended without interior support. So the dome, if you look closely, you can see that the dome has what look like decorative squares sort of recessed into the concrete. And that does, of course, create an optical effect. It is visually appealing to look at, but it does also mean there's less concrete required in those spaces. So the dome becomes almost a series of ribs that bear the majority of the weight of that space. So it actually helps to alleviate some of the weight of the dome overall. It would have been painted, the ceiling, blue with bronze stars probably in the center of those recessed areas that we refer to as coffers. The opening at the top is known as the oculus, and yes, it is open to the sky. There's no glass there. The rain does fall onto the floor. The tiles on the floor are ever so subtly higher in the center and taper to their edges, which allow the water to run out off of the floor, which is kind of remarkable. The entire design on the interior is repetitions of circles and squares. So it is kind of an homage to geometry, but very much in the tradition of Hadrian's taste. You can see that this building is very un-Greek. It looks like it's a traditional rectangular temple. You walk inside and it becomes a giant sphere. There are multitudes of different colors of marble, which are not only beautiful, but also symbolize the control that the emperor has over a vast territory. Those marbles that are used for the decoration on the interior come from a multitude of different places throughout the empire, so they also serve a symbolic purpose. The sun would most likely illuminate the entrance at the summer solstice, so you would have some alignment of the building with the path of the sun on the longest day of the year. It's a pretty remarkable accomplishment. When you see it from the side, you can see how un-Greek it really is. You can imagine how this would be confusing to an architect in the Greek era and how appealing it is to a Roman architect. It also, to me, reminds me very much of how our contemporary architecture has changed. We, in America especially, tend to amalgamate ideas from a multitude of different sources and put them together in a new way to create something unique, different, and new out of these disparate elements. That's very much the style and the heart of design, truly, of the height of the Roman Empire. You can see from above how odd the structure would seem. In this diagram, you can sense the recession into the wall of those coffers. So you can imagine that there's thicker concrete at the rib and at its thinnest point where those coffers are recessed. When you see the photograph up close of the coffers themselves, you can imagine how much more concrete would have to be there if that whole space were filled. You can also see that the ribs and the squares of the coffers in the dome of the Pantheon do not line up exactly perfectly with the elements below, so the whole thing seems to float a little bit and be almost as if it's in the act of rotating. So just as the sun moves across and illuminates different niches, we also have this effect of the detail in the ceiling seeming to rotate as well. So definitely interesting, I think, for us to consider why we use these languages, these architectural visual is in our own architecture centuries later. So remember, of course, that we, in a sense, modeled our republic on the idea of the Republic of Rome, that there would be a voting body of citizenry is very much at the heart of what our governmental system was meant to be. The use of this language also visually gives us legitimacy. It makes it seem that this upstart country has its roots even further back than the country that it rebelled against to gain freedom from England. So it is an architectural language beyond just a contemporary style at the time that those buildings were built. In our Capitol building, we also use a very American version of Roman ideas. The Romans made alterations to capitals. We actually used rather remarkable alterations to the Corinthian style in our own Capitol building. These are the Magnolia capitals, which are among several different types of capitals that were designed to replicate plants that were native to this country. There are also tobacco leaf capitals, believe it or not. It's kind of remarkable. So the ideas behind the art and architecture of the Roman Empire are really to show that the empire is vast, to show the power of the emperor, and it begins to become a little bit more of a symbolic language. You can notice that as we're looking at this base of the column of Antoninus Pius, that some of the figures seem to be a little bit repetitive. The figures seem a little too large for the horses that they're on. You can see that they're beginning to look almost more like repetitions of the same figure again and again, to give the sense of a massive group of peasants or soldiers in this case. You get a feeling that the imagery is more about telling stories now than it is about specific portraiture of individuals. Marcus Aurelius is perhaps the last great good emperor. He is fairly similar in appearance to Hadrian. You'll recognize him, though, for sure from his beard and from this oratorial gesture that he makes on his equestrian statue. He too appears a little bit too large for the horse. He is the only remaining cast bronze over life-sized equestrian statue of a ruler. He will be an inspiration throughout the Middle Ages into the Renaissance. It will be this figure in particular that multiple leaders to come are going to model their own monuments after. So Marcus Aurelius's equestrian portrait remains an incredibly important one for us for its influence on later art styles. You notice that although there is a slight error in terms of scale of horse and rider, if you really look especially at the body of the horse, you can see the mastery that the Roman artists have over anatomy. So remember that there is still an attention to detail that is inherent to Rome, even when things begin to change a little bit in terms of scale and style. The son of Marcus Aurelius is Commodus. Commodus was probably more interested in being a heroic athlete and gladiator than he was really in being an effective ruler. So here you see him portraying himself as Hercules. You can see him wearing Hercules' lion pelt, kind of remarkable. Let's skip a little bit ahead here to that. The multitudes of baths throughout Rome basically consist of a series of different types of bathing spaces. Now, these would have been public spaces. You could think of them in a sense as a combination of a health club, sauna, gymnasium, and also recreational space, but also a place to come to meet and to make business arrangements, to discuss things in a more informal way. You think of business being done in our country perhaps on a golf course. This would be a similar kind of opportunity to perform business in a less formal environment. The baths themselves, though, would consist of a multitude of different rooms. The most important for us would be the caldarium, which is the room that is the hot bathing area, the tepidarium, which is the warm bath, and then the frigidarium, which of course is for the cold bathing. So different health effects were believed to have been achieved by immersion in either quite hot, lukewarm, or quite cold water. Generally speaking, people would make a path through the baths from a changing room into cold, warm, and then hot rooms. So you get a sense of what the bathing was like. It becomes like a swimming pool more than a space to be bathing with soap, the way we might think of it today. But it is also an important social center. It is really one of the focal points of life in a major Roman city. The Baths of Diocletian, the four Tetrarchs, the Ark of Constantine, and the Basilica Nova fill in the remainder of our focus here at the end of the Roman Empire. So unfortunately, we have a period of severe civil war. There is an end to that civil strife brought about under the reign of several soldier emperors, but they're each one trying to maintain control, and there is an enormous amount of strife even among the soldier emperors. Diocletian, as I mentioned earlier, will establish the idea of four leaders, the Tetrarchs. He will sort of subdivide the empire among two Augusti and two Caesari. That, for us, seems like partially a logical solution, since this is a very large empire at this stage, and having all the power centrally located in one place might make it difficult to govern these vast territories. But as you can imagine, in our own country, if we simply divided the country in half or in quarters and had 4 simultaneous presidents, that obviously lead to a certain degree of strife and a lack of unity. So Diocletian's idea doesn't really work terribly well, and Constantine, when he comes to power, reconsolidates power under a single emperor. Constantine will also be the emperor who makes it legal to practice Christianity throughout the empire. He will also move his capital from Rome to Constantinople, and that will really mark the beginning of the fall of the empire. It will split from that point into 2 halves, a western half and what we call the Byzantine Empire, or the eastern half. The Byzantine Empire will last much longer, but the Western Empire will fall into decline very quickly thereafter. So this gives you an overview of the floor plan, the layout of the Baths of Diocletian. That building, believe it or not, has been repurposed into a cathedral. It now is, of course, a tourist site as well. So imagine that a lot of the buildings left behind by the ancient Romans have been reused as public spaces or for different purposes after the fact. The soldier emperors sometimes give us a sense of the concern and worry that they experienced during their reigns. You can also see a slight removal of attention to the emphasis on the fashion, on the hairstyles. You can see that this particular portrait bust, Trajan Decius, looks like he is just barely attended to his appearance before heading out to battle. He's closely cropped his beard and headed off to battle, but he looks concerned about the outcome. You can certainly see that the figures begin to look a little bit more like real human beings. They sometimes are heavier, sometimes slimmer, sometimes they have double chins. You can also see that a lot of attention now is going into storytelling in the image making in terms of carving, particularly in funeral sarcophagi. But you can also see that there's a lot of information being packed really close to the surface. So there is a sense almost more of this reading as a drawing or a painting on a flat surface, in a way, in terms of the illusion of three-dimensional depth that we have become accustomed to. We're seeing more of the figures as symbolic shapes very close to the picture plane. You can certainly see that in this example too. So it's kind of odd to put these two images together, but to take a look at where we started, the very first emperor, to where we have come now under Diocletian, here are our 4 co-leaders. And rather than looking imperious and heroic the way Emperor Augustus looked, these figures to me very much look as if they're kind of clinging to one another, almost in desperation to seek each other protection, and I think that's a fair way of looking at how the Tetrarchs may have operated. Reconstruction of the Palace of Diocletian, and a map that gives us the idea of the 4 co-rulers. So it's really kind of unfortunate to think about how the plan was meant to work versus how it actually came to pass. You can see how dividing the empire and creating 4 capitals would give each of the regional governors direct control over what territory they were responsible for. But you can see how that could lead to internal strife among the 4. And really, when you look at those figures, again, they look even less like specific individuals. Now, that's probably propagandistic as well. There's a portion of this need to project strength. There's a need also to make them all seem identical in a way, right? If they're all equally powerful, if they all represent one state authority, then it might make sense for them to come off appearing as sort of repetitions of the same form. However, they seem to lack believable anatomy underneath the armor that they wear. They seem to lack specificity in the faces. The proportions seem less elegant than we've become accustomed to. And again, the pose does seem to suggest what I imagine the artist was looking for was a sense of brothers in arms, that they were clasping one another by the shoulder in a show of strength and unity. But it does come off a little bit to contemporary eyes as if they're kind of huddled together, slightly in fear. You can certainly see that the specificity in those faces has really been reduced. Look at the attention in the eyes. It almost feels like we've gone back a bit to the styles that we were accustomed to, even before the Etruscans. Some of the examples we looked at in Mesopotamia really emphasized the eyebrow and those incredibly alert, overly large eyes. It does also beg the question, is the artist perhaps more interested in exploring aspects of abstraction? There's always a debate, I think, about whether art is good or bad when it deviates from objective reality. So there are a multitude of different ways to look at this type of work from near the end of the Roman Empire. Is it bad because it doesn't look as photorealistic as the veristic sculpture we saw in the Republic? Is it good because it explores geometricizing aspects of the human face and body? There are different needs that each of these objects would have to serve as well. So one has to try to factor in to any analysis of whether the work is superior or inferior, what was its overall purpose. And I think as we near the end of the empire, part of the purpose of the public art is more to communicate quickly the strength of the leadership and to give us a sense of who's in charge and what they're doing in a quick and easy to digest manner. When you look at the architecture left behind from the era of the Tetrarchs, you can clearly see how it was to transform some of their buildings into use for churches. And you can see, as we talked about earlier, the idea of the Basilica form being adapted into the form of the Christian church very easily. So this building, of course, was not initially for this purpose, but you can see how quickly and easily it functions in that way. When we look at the reign of Constantine, it's one of the more interesting examples, I think, of what public art can do is his triumphal arch. So this was built to honor Constantine, but it doesn't specifically honor a historic battle. In fact, it shows the emperor distributing money to his followers. So it is propaganda in that he is sharing the wealth with the people. It makes him seem very popular. It makes him seem somewhat more approachable, perhaps. But it also includes sculpture that belongs to other emperors' monuments. Trajan's defeated Dacians are here, 4 of them. We also have other sculptures from monuments to Hadrian. So you could argue that on one level he's making it look like he has done all these great things. I suppose you could argue it another way and say that he is trying to show his strength by aligning himself with them, by showing that he is descended from the same type of leadership, or that he's related in some way to the best of the emperors from the power of the empire. Remember again that Constantine is the emperor trying to heal the empire after the era of the Tetrarchs. He's trying to re-solidify control under one dominant authority. And so it's interesting to consider the various purposes of reusing other people's monuments, of taking pieces from other elements and using them in his own. Constantine also is known for this level of public making on a grand scale, and this set of ruins that you see here is actually from his monumental sculptural statue of himself. This is a reconstruction of what it probably looked like. We have portions of the leg. A lot of the torso is missing. We have some portions of this arm. Thankfully, the majority of the face still remains. And you can see that stylistically, his image of his portrait, I'm just trying to jump ahead to the portrait itself. I thought I had a better shot of it right there for you. All right, this is going to be our best bet. Bear with. this portrait of the emperor is not proportioned absolutely perfectly the way we might expect. The eyes are a little bit high, the skull is a little bit low, the eyes are definitely oversized, the brows, again, are somewhat over-exaggerated, just as we saw with the imagery from the Tetrarchs. There's a little bit of inelegance in the way the fingers and digits are handled in the hand. It is a figure that roughly the head itself is over 6 feet in height. So if that figure were able to stand up, and if he were to conform to the 7 or 8 heads in height, we would be looking at a statue that would truly be colossal. It would tower over you. And of course, that again is really meant as a propagandistic tool of reminding you that the emperors become gods in this culture, and that he has established his ultimate authority over a vast empire. You can imagine then that making it look quote-unquote realistic is not as much the goal of these artists. The goal is much more about showing the power of the leader. You can see that Constantine's empire really does include the territory that previously been controlled by the 4 Tetrarchs. You can imagine that what he's trying to do is maintain a sense of power in his move of the capital from Rome to what becomes known as Constantinople. So when he makes this move, it does set up the likelihood that the empire will split into a western and an eastern half, and in fact that's what it does. These are 2 pieces of sculpture from the Triumphal Arch of Constantine, and you can see a real difference. The medallions here, the circular elements, are from Hadrian's monuments, and they're much deeper carved. The proportions are a little more elegant. The figures move in a more believable way. The figures that are contemporaneous, new construction, new carving for Constantine's own time, are much more repetitions of the same body type again and again, and really to almost have the sort of Egyptian composite view happening again, with heads much too large for the bodies. So is it because the artists are lacking skill, or is it because they are trying to communicate an idea in a really quick, easy way, almost the way a cartoon communicates expressive ideas and motion, even though it's not photographically realistic to look at? We all understand it. We do know that the art that was available, that was decorating the homes of common people, outside of the elite powers, people with less money, tended more all throughout Roman history toward this more basic element. So perhaps Constantine's taste is really, again, trying to appeal to the masses, trying to show in his choice of style that he relates to their choices as well. It's really kind of odd when you see, especially in this example, Hadrian's medallions. There's Hadrian himself in this image. There's Constantine. He is literally trying to make himself look like he's descended from Hadrian, Marcus Aurelius. He is the same as they are, but look how much less individualized these figures are. Look how it's easy to read the faces of the emperors because their heads are enormously too big for the bodies. But again, is he doing this, making this choice? Are the artists doing this because they've lost the skill of the previous centuries? Or is it because they are trying to communicate quickly and to appeal to the masses? It's an interesting question. The last object of Constance to be aware of is the Basilica Nova. This is a basilica that was actually begun by Maxentius and completed by Constantine. So what we have of the remnants of it are the ends of these 3 barrel vaults here. And notice they are coffered as well. This is reconstruction of the Basilica Nova with the colossal statue of Constantine included in the space where it would have sat. So this piece was actually discovered in this very position. The gold that would have made up the majority of it, of course, have been scavenged long since. But again, you get a sense of the ability of using those large, rounded arched, cross-groin vaulted spaces to be able to open them for an enormous amount of light. This obviously would have been a really impressive public basilica space. And we certainly see seated leaders in temple-like structures as part of our own architecture and our own, I suppose you could call it, propaganda in Washington, D.C. This, of course, is the Lincoln Memorial, which has a colossal statue of a leader seated in it in a way similar to what Constantine was doing. We certainly see a reference to the Pantheon in the designs that were made by Thomas Jefferson in his own architecture, as well as in the monument to him. You can also see this taste for imitating the art of the classical era throughout the late 1700s into the first half of the 1800s. This is an American female sculptor living and working in Italy, Harriet Hosmer's bust of Zenobia, who was a queen who had been defeated, captured by the Romans, and paraded through the streets as a slave. So you get a sense of the dignity of someone oppressed by the Romans in this statue. We also see a taste in America for emulating the architecture of ancient Rome. This is a kind of interesting series of paintings by Thomas Cole. It's known as the Course of Empire, and it shows you the rise and then the fall of an empire. So what you're seeing here is the first chapter, so to speak, in this painting cycle, series of images that tell a story. This painting shows people in the savage state. You can see people who are dressed in skins. They're beginning to make rudimentary architecture, but they're really living off the land. This is the second in the series, Arcadian state. This is people living in perfect harmony with nature. They've found post and lentil architecture, religion, clothing. They're living close to the land. And then here's my favorite one, the consummation of empire. This is almost like what we imagine at its absolute height the Roman Empire would have looked like. But of course, anything that rises to this level of decadence and excess eventually is going to fall apart. This is the destruction of empire, and then the final image is the desolation of empire, or the ruins. So what we have left of Rome is after the fall. We also know, of course, that the Roman Empire extended all throughout most of the territory we've studied in Units 1 and 2, including into Egypt. And when we get to the Egyptian sarcophagi, it's kind of a bizarre mixture of two different cultural styles together. This is a mummy case that has both Egyptian hieroglyphic images and funerary images, as well as a very highly detailed, very Roman-style portrait rendered in encaustic. Encaustic paints are beeswax-based, and that's what you see above here. These are contemporary beeswax being heated, so it becomes liquid and mixed with pigment. It can then be painted when it's in this liquid state, but it hardens very, very quickly and remains very permanent. It needs to be done on hard surface, usually wood, and so we have quite a number of very sensitive and beautifully painted portraits from the Roman citizens of Egypt. These were found in Fayum. This is a funerary series of funerary portraits. So again, this is after Egypt has become part of the Roman Empire, and you can kind of see a fusion of those two different styles together. They feel perhaps a little odd to us, but I'm sure they would have made quite a lot of sense to the people who were part of this melded culture. The more that you think of Rome as being somewhat similar to our own culture, you can see how we're kind of blended from a multitude of different sources. The Romans were very much like that as well. What you're seeing on the right is a portrait, most likely the best representation we have of what Cleopatra probably looked like. Remember that Cleopatra was the descendant of Ptolemy, the general under Alexander of Macedonia, who had originally established Greek control of Egypt. And so when Cleopatra rises and has her dalliance with Julius Caesar, she most likely looked somewhat like a descendant of ancient Greece.